Hello, guys. Welcome back to my channel. We are going to do the second last lecture for this term, for this course as well. Um, I'm kind of getting the way to do this better, and I feel more confident. So hopefully, we'll be able to have a better lecture today. So, as I indicated in the email message that I sent yesterday to you all, the last lecture will be Tuesday next week, not Thursday, but Tuesday, April 7th, which is also the last day of classes, the official last day of classes. And besides the lecture, at the end of that session, I will start distributing the questions for the final exam. As you know, as it's stated in the syllabus, the answers are due 1 week later on April 14th. So it is important that you get them as soon as possible. So today we're going to address the second last area in which Latin America has innovated over the past few decades. And that area is foreign policies. As a matter of fact, not long ago, um, I listened to an interview made to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the candidate on the left in France. And he said, among many other things, that if any countries in the world were looking for creative ways in which establish an independent position and especially distance themselves from the influence of the United States, you don't have to look at Europe or other areas in the world, but you have to look at Latin America because, according to him, Latin America has established an interesting record over the past couple of decades of building some type of autonomy, some type of uh, independence from the influence of the United States, breaking the mold of the past. So let's start a little with a little bit of historical background. In the Cold War, that is to say, right after the end of the Second World War, the United States exercised paternalistic domination over Latin America. Of course, the main concern of this domination was to avoid the spread of communism in the region, and this concerted effort of stopping communism and claiming Latin America, all of the Americas, as a natural region of influence for the United States, started in the early 1950s. And many countries, I would say all of the countries in the Americas, suffered from this kind of paranoia, this determined policy of the United States to claim the Americas as a natural area of influence. You might remember when we're discussing demilitarization that when Honduras wanted to follow the Costa Rican example and get rid of their army in 1954, this possibility was no longer available because Honduras was forced to create a permanent army and to sign a mutual defense agreement with the United States. And this is just an example among many. The United States exercised a very tight control over the countries in the area, even though, in principle, these are sovereign countries. They were nonetheless pressured to adopt the policies that were in keeping with the interests of the United States. And those countries who defied the willingness of the United States were subject to a boycott or bad press, and in more exceptional circumstances, but nonetheless quite frequent, the United States would encourage and support military coup d'etat in the region. So there are many examples of that happening. It started with Guatemala in 1954. It was also clear in the policies in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, in in Brazil, in Chile in 1973, um, Argentina 1976. So there was this kind of cooperation of sorts between the United States and the regimes that were sympathetic to its interests. Um, there is a kind of a phrase that encapsulates this this approach that is attributed uh, uh, to President even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that is known as the father of the welfare state in the United States, but that nonetheless, at some point when he was asked about the Somoza dictator in Nicaragua and the violations to democracy, to human rights that he was committing, he said something similar to, "I know he's a bastard, but he's our bastard," right? Basically saying the United States is able to tolerate whatever kind of regime as long as this regime protects our interest there, and is open for business and is close to the influence of communists. Thus, approach, very kind of heavy-handed approach the United States had in Latin America, became even stronger after the Cuban Revolution, that was seen as a major defeat, as a major challenge to the interests of the United States, for a reason, of course, when in the early 1960s the Cuban Revolution turned to the Soviet Union for protection, which is the origin of the missile crisis in 1962. For those of you who don't know what that is, basically, the United States supported a military invasion to Cuba that failed. That is the uh, famous Bay of Pigs invasion. That's the name that is given to it in the United States. In Cuba, they call it the Playa Giron, or Giron Beach invasion that failed. It was defeated by, by, by the Cubans. And after which President Kennedy threatened to invade full scale uh, uh, the island, but by then Cuba was already in good terms with the Soviet Union, that was starting to install missiles in Cuba that were able to reach continental United States. After a very tense month of October in 1962, where that led to the you know confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over Cuba, in a personal conversation between President Kennedy and then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, there was an agreement to leave Cuba alone on the condition that the Soviet Union withdrew their missiles. Ever since, there has been a situation of standstill, with Cuba being subject to economic blockade from the side of the United States. But the invasion, the direct intervention, is already out of the question. So there was, again, to repeat what I was trying to say a moment ago, a very strong influence, a very heavy-handed intervention of the United States in the domestic affairs of Latin America, to make sure that communism would never take hold in that region. The two main instruments that were used for making this influence felt were the OAS, the Organization of American States, created in 1948. That is, for those of you who don't know, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but just to make sure that we are on the same page, it is a hemispheric organization, um, gathering all of the countries in the Americas. Uh, After the the Cuban Revolution occurred, the United States promoted a vote of exclusion for Cuba, and Cuba was kicked out from the OAS. But ever since, this organization has mostly served as a tool, as an extension of the interests of U.S. foreign policy in the Americas. The headquarters of the OAS, just to confirm this interpretation, is in Washington D.C., and it works very closely with the government of the United States. The other instrument that was devised for exercising this influence was an initiative that President Kennedy launched in the early 1960s that was called, because it's no longer existing, Alliance for Progress, that promised or offered economic aid to countries of Latin America, something quite similar to the Marshall Plan for reconstruction of Europe, in exchange, of course, for opening up the market in the Latin American countries to U.S. investments and U.S. imports, and more importantly, to keep a liberal democracy in place that would have no room for communism or revolution. So this situation is where the reading written by James Tolkien takes it from. This reading, uh, Shalom prepared a very interesting um, sets of slides that is already posted in e-class that you guys can consult for further clarification. But I would like to sort of provide a panoramic view of the situation in Latin America, and why, in order so you understand why this reading is important, and where exactly the Latin American innovation is in terms of foreign policy. So, at the end of the Cold War, the idea that communism was the major threat or the major uh, challenge to U.S. Influence in Latin America was no longer credible. The the Soviet Union had disappeared, the Soviet bloc too. There was no immediate possibility that some type of international communist movement would influence the countries in the area. So it was believed that was the era when uh, the United States expected to tap from this consensus by default in the area. There was no other alternative than following the United States. The initiative that the United States followed to kind of cement, to consolidate that consensus, was trade liberalization. The whole thing started in 1990, so right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, uh, with President George Bush Sr., that proposed an initiative of development for the Caribbean basin. So that is to say, for all the small countries in that part of Latin America, except for Cuba, obviously. Cuba was always excluded. It's still, to a large extent, excluded from the inter-American system. Uh, that was called just like that, Caribbean Basin Initiative. But that initiative was replaced the following year, in 1991, by another kind of more comprehensive, more ambitious idea that was called the Enterprise for the Americas. Enterprise for the Americas, you have to look at the words that are used. It was, yes, a task force. It was a major initiative. It was a program with ambitious goals of transformation. But the point of that transformation was to consolidate enterprise, not just any kind of enterprise, of course, but private enterprises, private corporations, private business in the region, with the support of the United States. The idea was then to create an open space for trade and investment, where corporations from the United States and from each and every country in the Americas would participate, sort of to give substance, to give a foundation to the liberal consensus that was being proposed, that was being created. The uh, enterprise for the Americas initiative morphed into a more concrete initiative that was launched in Miami in 1994 that was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA. Free Trade Area of the Americas was a kind of inspired, very strongly inspired by the recently adopted North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, opening up the economic space between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But the FTAA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, wanted to extend the same type of trade liberalization to the rest of the Americas. There was a very enthusiastic launch with participation of all countries in the area in Miami, and this was supposed to create a new um, consensus, liberal consensus in Latin America under the leadership of the United States. This trade liberalization, of course, was compatible, was accompanied by um, the the adoption of market policies in the domestic economies of each one of the countries involved. So domestic policies that were very much in sync, very much in agreement with the neoliberal policies that the United States promoted in the area. When we say neoliberal, you understand that we talk about a minimum government, privatization of corporations that were controlled by the government, leaving everything to the market, to private corporations, uh, cuts in government provided social services to sort of bring about a minimum state with a balanced budget, and an agenda that was anti-union and anti-popular organization that could put this program of neoliberalism and trade liberalization into question. The problem with this neoliberal policies is that over time, and didn't take very long for the people in the region to realize that they had very deep social impacts in terms of increased unemployment, increased poverty, increased inequality. Why is that? It is a very kind of clear manifestation of the failure of the assumptions of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism takes for granted that if you give the advantages to corporations, if you protect the interests of corporations and give all the expanded market and the ability to invest and trade in an open space, those corporations are going to grow. They're going to create employment. They are going to create prosperity, and that prosperity, that wealth, is going to trickle down eventually to the bottom of society through the creation of employment, through the salaries that are paid. So if you take care of the big ones, the rest of the society will benefit. In fact, this assumption proved wrong. It is not that way that uh, the economies prosper, but rather they increased inequality, concentration of income, and more unrest in on the streets. We've talked about that when we were discussing the policies that Brazil and other countries in Latin America adopted to sort of fight against inequality as a response to the concentration of income that neoliberalism. Other than the policies, the backlash against the neoliberalism also had another more interesting and more lasting consequence, and that is the rise of left-wing parties that would criticize and highlight the weaknesses of neoliberalism and the social impacts that these policies have. And these parties over time were able to acquire force and form governments in many countries in the area. This is what is called in the literature the pink wave. Pink because the red represents communism, and the elected governments in Latin America were not radical leftist groups. They were rather um, uh, on the left, of course, but rather moderate. And therefore, they are not red totally. They are just pink, like pale red. And away because there was a succession of parties on the left elected in different countries of Latin America from 1998 to 2014. So it's in alphabetical order, not in specific progression of time. Countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela elected governments on the left and started implementing uh, policies that were uh, not in keeping with that were critical of neoliberalism and tried to actually compensate for the negative impacts of this economic policy. So you make the count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 out of 20. The countries in the region turned to the left. Um, the two more notable exceptions there were Mexico and Colombia that had, did not elect a left wing government um, until much later. Actually, Colombia has never had a left wing government ever, and Mexico started having one only in 2018, late 2018. So these left wing governments were critical of the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, because they saw clearly that it was a project that was led by the United States, and that was a new um, iteration, a new project, a new attempt of rebuilding the consensus, or rebuilding the leadership of the United States in Latin America. That is why these governments started being the governments of the left started being more critical of the FTAA, showing kind of the shortcomings of trade liberalization, where there is an assumption that all countries are competitive and that everything is left to the market, to private corporations, by limiting the scope of what governments were allowed to do. So the first time when this free trade area of the Americas that was launched, as I said, in 1994, was openly challenged was in 2001, and it happened here in Canada. There was a summit of the Americas where the negotiation for the establishment of the free trade area of the Americas would happen. That but were met with huge demonstrations organized by critics of the government and supported by some of the left wing governments in the area. And more importantly, in the fifth summit of the Americas that took place in Mar del Plata, Argentina, in 2005, the initiative was completely discarded. In this Summit of the Americas in Argentina, there was an alliance of sorts of the government of Argentina itself, Brazil, and Venezuela, that together they convinced other countries in the area that this was a bad idea, that it was only a project that would benefit in the end mostly to the United States. This I mentioned these three governments: Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, because at that time they all had left wing governments. that understood very well the purposes of trade liberalization and how there was kind of a geopolitical interest behind this project. Uh, in order to replace this kind of U.S. leadership, there were some initiatives that were proposed uh, and took shape over time, starting with the so-called World Social Forum that gathered for the first time in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil, the city that you might remember is the first one that implemented the participatory budgeting originally. But these initiatives eventually started involving other governments in the area with the great with and thanks to them emerged something that we could call the intra Latin American regionalism, the creation of international clubs that would be alternatives to the OAS and to the FTAA, of course, that would create solidarity among countries of Latin America with the exclusion of the United States. I am not going to elaborate too much on those country or on those clubs that were created back then, because this is kind of the object of next week's lecture. But suffice it to say for the moment that there were alternatives, some of them more successful than others, some of them already still in place today that we're proposing a new way for the countries in the area, as opposed to simply following the United States as in the past. So this is why Joseph Tolchin, the reading that the first reading that is assigned for this unit, talks about the early 21st century in Latin America as the post-hegemonic era, an era where the hegemony or the ability of the United States to lead, to even dictate or to limit the scope of action of countries in the area is over. It is uh, rejected by many countries in the area. And when it's not rejected, it is at least avoided, right? There is not anymore this belief, this trust that the United States is the champion of freedom and economic prosperity in the area, because the countries have learned through liberal policies, through the Cold War uh, policies of the past, that the United States looks after their interest rather than for the good and prosperity of Latin America, and therefore people are more critical than in the past. I remind you that at any point in time, you can type questions or comments, and I'd be happy to address them at the moment that they are present. Another thing that also explains kind of the failure of U.S. interests in Latin America, the decline of U.S. interests in Latin America, is the foreign policy that was adopted in the United States itself. Uh, you might recall that in the early 2000s, the obsession of the United States was the Middle East, and this as a result of the 9/11 events that prompted a new foreign policy agenda in the United States of a regime change in the Middle East in order to get rid of the enemies of that country in that part of the world. So Latin America was largely either ignored or taken for granted during these years, and this in turn helped the rise of the pink wave of criticism to U.S. actions in the area, and eventually to the decline of leadership of this country in Latin America. When Barack Obama was elected in 2008, he was fully aware of this situation. He was concerned that his country was losing the control or was losing its influence over an important geographical area, traditional area of influence of the United States, and launched what is called the Obama Doctrine in order to